Over the past year, a little bit longer than a year, he's been the head of social impact at GitHub, which is an online platform where almost 100 million global programmers build and collaborate on software. As they put it, they are building the future of software. And I hope to come back to GitHub a little bit later in this conversation. Before that, Sid was Senior Director of Philanthropy at Microsoft for more than a decade and Director of Global Philanthropy, Government, and Public Affairs at HP for 8 years. But he's also served in the public sector in some really distinguished ways, including as mayor and city councilman for the city of Palo Alto, and as an assistant to Attorney General Janet Reno at the Department of Justice. He's active as a volunteer in his capacity as council member at the Nature Conservancy, a board member at Tide, a board member at the Palo Alto Art Center Foundation, and formerly on the board of trustees at Wesleyan University, where he attended his undergrad and later went on to graduate from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. So I want to take a minute and start from early on. Sid, you shared some things in an interview for Wesleyan magazine where you talked about your upbringing, and you mentioned specifically the role that your father, Abel, an immigrant from Mexico, played, and your mother, Janet, who was an activist and an educator. What's their legacy? What did they pass on to you?
First, let me say I am humbled by even having this conversation and oddly talking about myself in front of this group of truly friends to a person around this this room and this forum. Such incredible leaders with an incredible legacy. And so just privileged to be in conversation with all of you. Thank you, Tom, for the interview and for the question. And let me also just say that it is, it was a debate as we were starting some of these series, whether or not we would record them. And part of what we had talked about was if we can get a collection of recordings over time of Latino leaders from around the region that can sit in a space that then students could visit later, that people could go and listen to on their own time, that could be shared in different types of forums. What a great opportunity that would be to have these stories live on. And so if anyone is watching this later, if there's a student who's following it, look around the other people on this Zoom and learn about their histories and stories, because it's incredible work that they've done. Yeah, my parents, I grew up in Gilroy, down at the bottom of the valley, and it was idyllic, frankly, in many ways. As a childhood, we were out on a farm, and I had a dad who had come to this country from Nayarit, from Mexico, and was young, and I think really struggled. He was so excited to be in this country, but I think he saw the opportunities here, but his heart was still in Mexico. And I think he spent a lifetime with his heart in Mexico, which I think we'll come back to later. My mom is Norwegian and Scottish. She was getting another master's degree at Stanford. I mean, she had this whole life continues to have a whole life as an activist, and has run large nonprofit organizations, was a professor, was a teacher, et cetera. I mention this because part of that legacy for me, as you mentioned in a career, has sought to balance really with the theme of how do we have an impact? How do we leave this place better than we found it? How do we empower others and fix systemic issues in our communities? It's had this balance, maybe not surprisingly, between sort of the activist mom that I had and really thinking a focus on education and thinking about the power of nonprofit organizations, and my dad who ended up being in tech and really, was at the Valley as that whole wave took off, really focused on entrepreneurship, et cetera. And so not so surprising that professionally I've had a career that's sort of balanced those two things. But I think on a personal level, my parents were fundamental and instrumental in who I became, and thinking about my values and thinking about how I think about relationships and family and work, how I spend my days, how I spend my off time. There's no two people, more instrumental in creating who I am than them, for sure.
You talked about how, we're all the product of people from different backgrounds, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, people with, we all represent a mixture, right? And we all, there's always this sense of balance, the tech entrepreneur, the activist, ethnically, we have these different backgrounds, maybe different parts of Mexico, maybe someone from Mexico, somebody from North America, from Canada, so how have you tell me a little bit about how you've kind of woven together different backgrounds into your identity, into who you are, and a weaving together of this mixture.
Yeah. I think this has been, honestly, it's been really tough. It's been part of a struggle throughout my life. And I think it will increasingly be so in our society across the US, as more and more children are interracial or have sort of a mixed family in a certain way. I was, and I'm happy to get into the details, but just really quickly, I always felt othered, frankly, in many ways. I was with my white side of the family, and I would be asked, and there was very specific and difficult racism on that side. My mom was disowned from the family when she started dating somebody who wasn't white, and her parents didn't talk to her for 30 years. So, real on that side. And cousins on that side would be asking, like, where are you from again? So you're like an immigrant from the, yeah, I'll own that. But I also was, born in Kaiser, Santa Clara, but from their perspective, I was not white. And then I would go to the Mexican side of the family, and they were like, if you want us to explain to them that you are really white, that you are white, we can do that. And so to always, I think children so much seek unconditional love and acceptance, and to not have that on either side, it manifests itself in so many different ways. I think my dad really didn't want us to face some of the discrimination he had faced when he got here, so was really focused on us speaking English when we were young, et cetera. And then when we got into middle school, high school, he's like, okay, only Spanish, because you guys don't speak Spanish well enough when we go to Mexico every year. And by then we were like, oh, Dad, who are you kidding? That's not us anymore. That's not who we are. And so it wasn't debilitating. It wasn't something, which I think can happen for a lot of kids. It wasn't something that affected me in a way that hurt. It hurt in the long term, but I think it was ever present. And I think it's a theme that goes through my life, is like finding boundaries. And I think the way that it manifested itself for me over time, probably in a mode of survival, is sort of becoming chameleon. Like I find myself in so many different situations, and people are always surprised that I can just sort of flow into, I don't know, I don't want to set up crazy scenarios, but like I'm in the East Bay and I'm in a tough community, and people are like, oh, this seems like your community. And then I'm in Pack Heights, I'm here in San Francisco at like a $40 million home, and people are like, these are your people too. It's just like I travel overseas and people feel like, oh, you really get us. And I think it's a skill probably that I had to develop over time to have the feeling of security that I needed. I think the flip side of that then is that you always struggle, both personally and in connections with others, to make sure that you're authentic to yourself and really understand who you are, and that you're not always just trying to blend with where you are.
Yeah. I think I think everyone on this call and everyone who's listening will see that you absolutely have a center. And it's not all about being a chameleon and about code switching, which I think we all can identify with that as well. One of the first times that one way you had to do that was going from growing up, you said you were from Gilroy, you go to school at an elite university on the East Coast. What was that transition like?
I knew I wanted to get away. I think what happens with lots of kids is they don't appreciate where and how they grew up until they're older now. And so many people come back to home and think like, wow, my childhood really was amazing. But at the time I was like, get me out of here. I should be someplace else. And so I wanted to go, and going across the country, Connecticut was a huge move. At the time, there was a program that took Latino students. We were 13 of us, I think, from across the state, the region, and took us to 15 schools or so back east to visit. And it was a really interesting conversation, I think, for us as Latino leaders I think so many people will recognize, and I was not in this category, but so many of these folks already knew they had the grades and the scores and everything to get into to elite schools. And so, but they had families at home. So here was, a student who was planning to apply to Yale, was getting in, but then was almost certain that, the parents would say like, absolutely not. Like, why you have to be near your family? Why would you be going across the country? And here was this opportunity to go to, an incredible school. And they're like, there's incredible schools in California. Why do you need to, and I had this years later as well, when I was on the board at Wesleyan. And we had a student in East Palo Alto who got into the school, and the school contacted me and said, we really want this student. This student is incredible, and we really want this student to come. Can you go talk to the parents in Spanish, of course, happy to do it. And it really was the mom. The mom was like, no, like Foothill is right here. Like, there is no need for this kid to go across the country. And it was the oldest son. It needs to be here for the younger kids, needs to support the family. But we got there, and he had an incredible career at Wesleyan. He came back, had incredible career in finance, and now is in East Palo Alto again, doing work for the community, which is just incredible to see that come full cycle. But for me, again, I was ready to go. So I ran. And then when I got there, it was like hitting a brick wall where you just realized, even in my dorm, my freshman year, and there were students coming from California, and everybody I met seemed to be like coming out of a prep school or coming out of a boarding school where they had, I'm thinking about the couple from California that were right next to me. One had worked for the summer for National Geographic doing underwater photography off the coast of Chile, right? I was like, what? In high school, because in high school in Gilroy, I was not doing that, right? They were coming in speaking fluent Mandarin. I'm like, you had Mandarin? And like, what is I thought I was an amazing writer, and several of my professors, I was editor of the yearbook. I was, wrote for the school newspaper, all that stuff. They're like, you need to go into intense writing workshop training to get up to this level of. And and it was humbling for sure. But I think that one of the legacies of my dad was that he always instilled in us to never think that we are better than anybody, but also that no one is better than us. That there is that we are all human getting through this experience together, and that that we treat each other in a way that is respectful, and that we own and we lean into our that reality, and that we don't shy away from it, and that, okay, so I'm not prepared yet, so let me just get prepared for this experience and to dive in. And so I didn't go in, I think, like a lot of students, and I think we need to talk about this more as a Latino community, like so many students that we get into certain universities or get into certain jobs and then think that's where it ends. They should be able to succeed now, and don't provide the mentorship or the community or the extra support so that they can really thrive in those spaces. And then folks end up dropping out or sort of leaving jobs and other things. And we say, well, they couldn't, we don't always provide the support that people really need. We just think that as long as the door's open, we've answered for them. And so I felt like I had a great support system when I got there. I felt like I deserved to be there, and I was gonna make it happen. I think, and leaving was never an option in our family. Like, so much was being paid for this, so I needed to work it out. And going back to the and I founded like the first mecha program there as well, because speaking of the Latino experience, you go to New England and it's like everybody's from New York who's Latino. It was like, are you Puerto Rican? Are you Dominican? And the food, the way they speak, everything was so different, right? And they were like, who are you? And Chicano, what are you talking about? Chicano experience. I mean, just everything I would, Cesar Chavez references all this, they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, that's not, and so that was really interesting. And so there were a couple of us from California and from Texas and Arizona, and we formed this, a Mecha chapter there and sort of grew that into a whole community and a house that, eventually became a significant part of campus. But it was a fascinating time to think about how to, get across that bridge into the next chapter of my life. And I stayed on the East Coast for 10 years before I came back to California. And I loved it. I mean, it was I went to DC afterwards in the White House of the DNC. And working on Latino at the Latino Outreach Office at the DNC, which was amazing, thinking about the campaigns we were running in '94 as the Republican Revolution came in with Newt Gingrich and the contract. We called it the contract on America.
On America, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And then the White House, working for two incredible Latina leaders there. And then Justice, as you mentioned, the Justice Department, Janet Reno, and then grad school before coming back. But it was, it was a fascinating time.
So initially, you thought it was going to be the public sector where you were going to have the most impact. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially I kind of went back and forth where my dad really had hoped that my dad, I think, has this vision that there should be like, he's the breakthrough generation. I mean, he became successful, et cetera. And then like the next generation is really entrepreneurial and makes a lot of money. And then like the next one is the public service generation. This is like the legacy of like, crazy families and right, like the dynasties. And then you get like the artists maybe who like lose the money and then they start over, right? Like that cycle. And my dad's like, what happened to the entrepreneurial make a lot of money cycle? Like, why are you and your sister both like so focused on public service, so focused on careers that are not going to make you a fortune? So I probably had a little bit of that early on, that I was thinking like, okay, what will this be in service, but how can I also make some money? And then once, you get into and I think everyone around this room understands that like you get into the complexity of working on any of these issues, the cross-sector nature, the cyclical poverty that sort of permeates this work. And you realize, number one, you're not going to solve these things in your lifetime. Like you really have to understand the people before you who have worked on these issues and what they've tried. Like everything has been tried. Like people come up and they're like, I want to start a new nonprofit that's working on like cleaning up the Bay to me. And I'm like, so there already are a few. Like, let's not think that nobody's doing that, right? Like so understand what others have done. Figure out something that's like, or several things that like during your time of holding that baton in this relay race that you can affect change and that it's like fulfilling. And how do you have your emotional support, how you're smart about that, how you build coalitions, how you do this. And then succession planning, like how do you hand that off to the next generation? How do you ensure that that work continues? And so in, thinking about that kind of modeling, I, really sought then to get specific about what unique value add can I bring? What skill sets do I have that are different? What life experience, cultural experience, et cetera, can I bring to the table that will really help to affect change on some particular things? And that, that was sort of the next understanding and self-reflection.
So you've spent a decade on the East Coast, undergrad, working in the White House, working for Janet Reno. You've gone to Harvard Kennedy School. You come back to California, and you make a switch. It's a big change from going, well, I mean, to my eyes, it looks like a switch. Tell me about the genesis from going from the public sector into this role at HP.
Well, and by the way, there are so many parts of this story that I'm like, I want to like pull everybody in. Ron was at HP before that. I could tell the whole history of some of the work that had been happening there, and incredible leadership, obviously, and being both tech and in public service as well. I had studied philanthropy when I was at Harvard, and there's a Center for Philanthropy there. And so that really helped me with that pivot of thinking about that, good and bad, by the way. Like, philanthropy is not a perfect sector by any means, and there are all sorts of questions about the hoarding in some ways of that wealth just by a different type of institution, and the slow disbursement of those funds. I think we talked a lot about it in this region with all the need, with the phenomenal, unprecedented, historic wealth in this region, and yet some of it not struggling. And there's so many people around this room as well who are leaders in philanthropy and who have thought a lot about this work and who have created institutions to seek to bridge some of these divides. But I came back, saw a great opportunity in this region within the ever-growing tech space and ever-growing wealth within it to think about some of those connections between tech and community. And HP has had and continues to have, in different ways, an incredible legacy in the space. That HP connections ended up going deep in many ways. It was Gary Fazzino, who was there in government affairs, who really got me involved in politics and sort of led to that. I started working on a lot of ballot measures and bond measures in the city, working on different people's campaigns, serving on boards, joining the chamber, sort of doing all this stuff. And I started getting so involved and talking so much about the issues in the community. People are like, when are you going to run? Like, what's happening here? Why aren't you? So it had that legacy. I also lived for years. There is the garage where Hewlett and Packard started HP in 1937, 38, that then is now a National Historic Landmark, California Historic Landmark as well, that is recognized as the birthplace of Silicon Valley. And that was my house. That was my garage for many years, which was an odd experience, as well as like thousands of people would come every month. They couldn't go inside, but they would just I'd come out in the morning to get my paper, and there would be sort of a busload of Japanese tourists taking pictures down, and Ohio, good morning. Anyway, it was a incredible piece of history that I was able to be a part of for a while. We renovated that property and then wanted to keep it for prosperity. So yeah, it's great.
So I have time for a couple more questions, and I want to open it up to the rest of the room, because I see a lot of people nodding their heads. So I feel like that people are identifying and with you, and what you're saying is resonating with them. Tell me about your time in Palo Alto and how that developed, and how you developed you have a distinct leadership philosophy, and you alluded to it before about this idea of doing as much as you can and then passing on the baton. It was passed on to you at HP, you passed on to others. Talk about Palo Alto and talk about how that was formative in your development of your philosophy of what it means to be a good leader?
Well, I'll just say before, because I think amongst these friends, it was an interesting and difficult choice. And we talked a little bit about this, Tom, in a pre-call that we had about where I would land and what community really meant and where I could add the most value as I came back to California. My sister, while I was in Palo Alto, my sister, and we're very close, it was in East Palo Alto as a teacher and then a principal, and she really has an incredible legacy of taking some of the most underserved schools and communities and turning them around to be the highest performing schools above all others, and really anyway, just a phenomenal educator. And she was in East Palo Alto and living in East Palo Alto. And for folks who don't know, maybe are listening later or something, that these two cities are side by side, but in different counties. One is one of the wealthiest in the world, and the other has had a legacy of really struggling with cycles of poverty, was the murder capital of the US back in the 90s, really went through more recently a very difficult transition between being a majority African-American Black community to the highest percentage of Latinos in a community in the city in Northern California. And so that the Black-Brown politics, really difficult. And continues with a lot of those struggles. And so, part of it was a conversation about why am I doing Palo Alto and not East Palo Alto? Like, couldn't I better serve the Latino community in East Palo Alto, truth be told? And that was very difficult for me to sort of think through. And identity of like, did I feel like I best represented that community? And did I feel like people there would feel authentically like I was the voice for that community? Was there ways that I could work in that community and assist in other ways and empower instead people from that community and of that community in that work? And I don't know, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. It was really tough to come to terms with that. Happy to talk about that more. But on the flip side, I had in Palo Alto, again, it goes back to the very first point, which is why I made it. And the flip side in Palo Alto, I think I had people who sadly loved that they were voting for a Latino who was just Latino enough for them, right? Like, not with an accent, went to a school that they went to, that it was very like Palo Alto, great. They could like check their liberal box, but and that was very difficult for me as well. My campaign team talked about it a lot. They're like, no, they love it. They love that they're voting for the Latino. I'm like, it like makes me sick in my stomach the way that we even talk about this. But that was an interesting part of being in a community like Palo Alto that is not particularly diverse, that is incredibly wealthy. But it was where I was living. It was my community, and there was a lot of work that we needed to get done. And so to really drive redoing all of our libraries, which infrastructure issues were significant, getting the hospitals rebuilt, creating a bike and pedestrian master plan, balancing the budget. I mean, I had a whole list of things that I was really excited about in making the community better and better providing services and thinking about how to engage parts of the community, because it was very much in transition, even in Palo Alto, and how to activate civic life in a way that, we had, as an example, one, we had a lot more people deciding they were going to retire there than we ever had before. So we didn't have infrastructure really built for seniors in that way. The state had started to publish school comparisons in a way that they hadn't in the past. And it became really clear that Gunn and Pali in Palo Alto were two of the best in the country. And almost immediately we saw a massive influx of Asian community into the city, specifically to the schools that would like provide that pipeline. And by the time I left, the elementary schools were, I think, 37% Asian, which was a massive shift. over just like a 10-year period for a community like Palo Alto. But you saw no Asian faces in other aspects of civic life. Like they were not represented at all. And so, there were just a bunch of things that I thought were exciting to think about. How do we do this better? How do we and engage this community in a better way? So anyway, there was a lot of stuff that was exciting for me about Palo Alto. And I loved serving in office. It was great. I sort of surprised a lot of people when I left after 5 years, just because I wanted to go and take on other things. But it was wonderful. Like I really look back on it as a highlight in my life for sure, and a privilege to have been able to serve in that way.
And just briefly looking ahead, we all care about the work that needs to be done.
It's like retirement, looking ahead to a nap.
There's so much
I think
on your mind, and for those of us in the Latino community and the work that needs to be done, what's keeping you up at night?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that in maybe 3 different ways. One, I'll just say, the shift to Microsoft, where we're doing several $1 billion a year in philanthropy, was a shift to really think about scale. How do we work on a global basis? How do we, really leverage that power for systemic change? What issues do we choose, and how do we work across that space? So phenomenal opportunity there, and GitHub in particular, which you had mentioned. I moved to a year ago. Microsoft bought the company. When we bought the company, there were 25 million developers on the platform, already the largest community of developers in the world. In these 4 years, it's grown to 90 million, and we'll get another 50 million developers in the next 5 years. That didn't exist, 10 years ago in history. Like it couldn't even have been imagined. And what we know is that so many of them are focused on social change, on creating tools and creating companies, creating apps that are tackling some of the world's biggest problems. So the job now, the opportunity, the reason to make the move, what's next is to think about, what do we do with that? Like, how do we locate those people? How do we build community? How do we empower them? How do we work at scale? Just by way of example, when we were talking about digital divide issues, which is another big thing to think about, the things on my mind, but digital divide issues that we were working on 25, 30 years ago, it was about so many people not getting the training, not getting the skills, et cetera. These 50 million developers that we are bringing on board are almost all from the global South, from Africa, from Latin America, from Southeast Asia. That pipeline was created, right? Like we sought 30 years ago to create the nonprofits, the curriculum development, the training programs, et cetera, so that there would be these developers to have these opportunities, and they will leapfrog. Like they will be able to engage in these global tech communities, in jobs and skills, et cetera, in a pipeline that just didn't exist before. And so it's so exciting to think about the economic development that will come from that in communities around the world. And again, so many of them committed to social change and addressing issues that are local to them. So anyway, that's what's next on that. I'd say, lastly, just sort of what keeps me up at night, or is that there's still so much work to do. That like we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I am very much a believer in that things continue to get better, but it takes time. Change is hard for people, and living through the steps back is always difficult. But I have faith that it's still moving in the right direction. We just have to continue the conversation going. I guess that's
well, Sid. Thank you for the role that you are playing in helping us move in that direction. I know we're running out of time. I want to turn it over to Javier, if I'm correct on the agenda, but is there anyone